The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
The construction boom in this province will not let up as long as the housing shortage remains. But in the rush to raise skyscrapers and build homes, workers are often put in harm's way. We'll hear about the troubles construction workers are dealing with and how government and industry must respond. Then we turn to journalism and discuss how to navigate digital disruption and declining trust with the profession in the era of fake news. Health and safety and standards and ethics across two professions, all ahead on the agenda. Ontario saw 2 fatalities on construction sites since the beginning of winter, not to mention numerous injuries. As an industry with a labor force of almost 600,000 in this province alone, how adequate is training and safety on the job? And what are the risks these workers face off the job? Here to discuss these issues, plus how to protect those in the profession, we welcome Leah Nebel, partner at Blaney McMurtry LLP and co-chair of the firm's construction law group. Michael Gallardo, CEO at Merit Ontario, a contractors association. Amina Dib, manager of government and stakeholder relations at the Residential Construction Council of Ontario, also known as ResCon. And Shane Mercer, senior journalist at Canadian Occupational Safety. Welcome to you all. Thank you so much for joining us in studio. Michael, I'm going to start with you. What are the leading causes of injury and death in Ontario's construction industry?
I would say when you look at the industry as a whole, it's trips, slips, and falls comes to mind, and that's the jargon in the industry. I would say falls are probably the leading cause of injuries on the job site. I think as an industry, it's acknowledged that more needs to be done, but at the same time, there's a lot of investments. The government's investing a lot of money and energy into appointing a chief prevention officer, into making sure that the industry is supported by many means necessary.
All right, Shane, I'm going to get your take on this. This is what you do. You cover anytime there is an incident or something. If you go onto your website, you've got it covered. You're talking about it. I want to get an idea as well to what Michael said. What are some of the leading causes of injury, and how safe is our construction industry as well? Well,
you know, how safe is it? I mean, what are we comparing it to, right? If we're comparing it to all other industries in Canada, or in Ontario in this case, it's one of the highest hazard industries out there. Right. Meaning that, you know, it can be very unsafe. You know, Michael mentioned slips, trips, and falls, industry jargon, but that does, you know, make up a large amount of the types of injuries that we see and how they're caused. But what are the root causes of those slips, trips, and falls? Why did they fall? Why did they slip or trip, or what did they fall off of working at heights? So, you know, that's one aspect of it. But there's so many other areas. Struck by incidents are very high and common. So we're talking about hit by a beam, hit by a large piece of wood, something moving in the air. There's so many hazards on a construction site. In addition to that, struck by incidents, well, there's all that heavy machinery. And that, you know, poses a lot of risks, both for the people around the heavy machinery, but also those operating it. Construction workers find themselves in all sorts of different scenarios too, right? Construction work could be building a high-rise apartment building, like we see a lot of here in downtown Toronto, but it could be an infrastructure project, working at the side of a road or at the side of a highway. It could be working in a sewer. And, you know, you mentioned some fatalities that occurred recently. That was one that occurred recently. We saw a construction worker drown in a sewer in Mississauga at the beginning of December. That was an issue that, you know, stems from working in confined spaces. So, you know, these are some of the ways that people die and get hurt on construction sites. Many ways.
Leah, I'm going to come to you. For over 40 years, the Ontario Health and Safety Act has been keeping workers safe, and one of the key legislations that regulates construction safety. Break it down for us a little bit. Tell us a little bit more of the significance of this act when we talk about the construction industry.
Sure. So the Ontario's Occupational Health and Safety Act is the statute in Ontario that sets out the health and safety requirements for workplaces in Ontario. So it's a law that has to be followed, and there are many sections in the Act that set out duties and obligations of various people. So specific to the construction industry is a person known as a constructor. That's a defined term in the Act. And the significance of being a constructor on a construction site, and typically that role would fall with a general contractor. So an owner hires a general contractor to build a building. Usually the general contractor becomes the constructor under the Act. And that person is responsible for ensuring that everybody on the project complies with the Act and everything that needs to be done to ensure safe working conditions. Now, there's also a term called employer. So a constructor can also be an employer.
Okay.
So legal liability is one of the reasons why being the constructor matters, because when there is an incident, an injury, or a fatality, the constructor could be charged under the Occupational Health and Safety Act for violating a certain provision. But typically it's the boots on the ground people that are, to have a site supervisor to make sure that, hey, if somebody's not tied off, telling that worker,
Right.
you better tie off.
Okay, very good. Amina, I'm going to come to you. When it comes to safety and training and resources, what are the biggest challenges for both employers and workers?
Yeah, so I think working in construction, the construction industry is a very dynamic environment. Workers are operating in that dynamic environment, and really the only constant is change. And while employers, they identify hazards and they either mitigate or eliminate them, the constant change is a challenge. I would actually say it's what we're seeing in the last 5 to 10 years. I would frame it more as an opportunity. So health and safety has become all-encompassing. It's not just limited to the health and safety department or a couple people on site. It's really every facet of an organization now. And with that, we've had the opportunity in construction to include and incorporate diversity, equity, and inclusion, and mental health and wellness into our health and safety plans. And again, I would frame that more as an opportunity, but it is an added consideration to take into account.
Shane, I'm going to get your take on that as well. When it comes to safety and training and resources, what would you say is some of the biggest challenges for both employers and workers? Do you see it as Amina says, an opportunity here?
I mean, yeah, training is obviously at the core of safety, right? And so making sure that workers are adequately trained for the job they're going to be performing is a challenge for the companies, and it all depends on whether that company is hiring unionized workers or not. That plays a pivotal part in what kind of training those workers are going to have. So what we tend to see is that unionized workers are typically better trained. They are further along in their training. So what I mean by that is that they're journey persons as opposed to apprentices. They've got more experience applying that skilled trade, so whatever it may be, electrical, plumbing, etc. Additionally, the unions tend to heavily invest in safety training to the tune of $40 million a year. That's a national figure, not necessarily here in Ontario, but they significantly invest in safety training. And so you're more likely to have workers who have the certifications that they need to work at heights, to work in confined spaces, to operate that piece of heavy machinery. Amina also mentioned how dynamic the construction industry is. There are many different certifications required for the various jobs that could be performed. And one job might take a week, and then they move on to another job where a whole new set of safety training and requirements are needed. So as you can imagine then that for a construction company or the union, but if it is a company that's hiring non-unionized employees, how difficult that might be for that company to keep up on that training.
All right, with that, I'm going to have to come to you, Michael. Of course, your organization represents open shop employers and employees, meaning that they're not members of unions. And to add to that, according to the Institute for Work and Health, the injury rate of construction workers in Ontario is 23% higher among non-unionized workers. How concerning is that? But I want to give you a chance also to respond to what Shane said there as well.
Absolutely, and first I want to address safety is not a non-union or union issue. It's I think all contractors, and having been on both sides representing both union and non-union contractors, I think when you look at safety, it's a motherhood. It doesn't stop at the door. It's on the job sites everywhere in the company. So all companies, whether union or non, are committed to safety. I've talked to employers. We provide training. It's simply not true that union job sites are safer. 70% of the marketplace in Canada, I would say, is non-union. Many companies, many contractors, whether they're GCs, whether they're subcontractors, whether they're specialty contractors, they take safety seriously. I think anytime there is an incident, it's far too many. But bottom line, it is not true that union sites are safer. A lot of it is rhetoric that you hear in the marketplace. Merit Ontario has invested millions of dollars in safety. We provide safety training online. We provide it to make sure that companies up north receive the training because of accessibility. We make sure that we provide new and innovative solutions for training. We provide virtual reality training for for youth coming into construction. So I think, to get down that rabbit hole of union versus non-union, I don't believe in that. I mean, I love construction. I think we need to talk about the positives of construction. I think we need to talk more about that it offers so many opportunities for people looking for a career in construction. I think not one employer that I know doesn't believe in safety. And I think, it's always a tragedy, but I think, when you think about all the employees that they hire, not one of them, they all care about their employees. They want to make sure when they show up to a job site, they go home safely to their families.
Okay. Amina, I want to come to you. How does gender factor into the health and safety on construction sites?
I think certainly women, it's no secret that women are few and far between in the construction industry. Ranges no more than, I think, 7%. Construction workers are women on site. And like I said before, within the last couple of years, more employers and people on site are really starting to point out that if you're a woman and you're not getting treated properly, whether you're being bullied or you can't find well-fitting personal protective equipment, whether that be the boots, the hard hat, the vest, you're not going to feel included. And inclusion is a health and safety issue. If you don't feel included because you're a woman, you might not feel comfortable going to the health and safety rep or your foreperson to maybe ask a question about am I doing this right? I don't know if this is a safety concern. So certainly it is women are treated differently, and I think that's a health and safety concern, but I also think it's a skilled trades issue from a recruitment and retention standpoint.
Lee, I'm going to come to you. Even outside of the construction industry, all workers have the right to refuse unsafe work. But when we talk about the construction industry, is it always easy to do so? Because I know you've worked on a number of cases and stuff. It is not as simple as that.
You are correct. Under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, all workers have the right to refuse unsafe work. And that could be a piece of machinery or equipment that the user, if they were to use it, would put themselves in danger or would put a worker in danger. So I think Amina has already touched on this a little bit. Some female workers may feel a little bit reluctant to mention potential safety health and safety issues. Maybe they don't want to be seen as not being tough on the job. Maybe there's a fear of reprisal, although under the OHSA, you can't be dismissed or anything like that for reporting what you believe to be something that's going to put your life in danger or somebody else. It could also be somebody who's newer to Canada, who's just starting out in the construction industry. Maybe they're sending money home and they're fearful for their jobs. They don't want to cause any trouble. Everybody knows that once there's an issue, depending on what the issue is with health and safety, it could cause a delay on the project as well. So people want their projects to be done on time and on budget. And so I think sometimes, depending on the position that you're in on the construction site, you might feel reluctant to report it. But you should. You really should.
Shane, I'm going to come to you to follow up on that. Is it more challenging for a certain group of workers? When I think of some incidences, there's one in 2009 that rings a bell, migrant workers who died in Toronto after falling from a scaffolding on Christmas Eve, and I believe it was 4 workers who were working on a high-rise, I believe. Is it more challenging for a certain group of workers?
Yes, absolutely it is. So I want to pick up on 2 points that have been made. First, by Michael. Everybody cares about safety. Okay? Whether it's the company, the union, government, I have never spoken to anybody who says they don't care about safety. Okay? Everybody wants their employees to go home at the end of the day. That being said, you referenced the study from the Institute for Work and Health.
Yep.
23%. That was from a data set that led up to 2011. They did a second group of research that looked at data from 2012 to 2018, and the number was actually even higher. It was closer to 30% of fewer lost time injuries among unionized workers as opposed to non-unionized workers. So the research is there. It speaks for itself. So are there workers who have greater challenges? I would say that non-unionized workers have a greater challenge on a job site based on the research. This isn't something that I'm making up. This is what I've gathered from talking to people and from what I've seen in terms of studies and research. So I think that that's important to point out. Another group of workers who experiences challenges on job sites are women. Amina brought it up, personal protective equipment. The CSA group recently did a study that found something like 46%, almost half of women working in skilled trades in heavy industry. So whether that's construction or it could be oil and gas or another form of heavy industry, found, almost half of women who were surveyed reported not only not having proper PPE, proper fitting PPE, but actually being hurt on the job because they didn't have that personal protective equipment. So those are 2 groups of workers that I would say experience more challenges in the industry.
I'm going to have to get you to respond, of course, to Shane. And then I do want to ask you after that as well. You know, many of these workers in construction sites are foreign workers on work permits. Are there adequate resources to ensure the safety of those workers as well? But I'll get you a chance to respond to Shane.
Absolutely. So first and foremost, that study that Shane's referring to was a study done by a pro-union lobby group, an advocacy group. I'm not here to question the validity of the findings, but again, I go back to the idea that you mentioned migrant workers. Anybody that gets into construction, it's the employer's responsibility to ensure that there's competency in the field.
Right.
For example, if you tell me, hey, I'm very capable and I have the ticket to run this heavy equipment, no problem. You show up to the job site, and we have to assess competency. We have to ensure that for your own safety and for the safety of those around you. So employers are always and constantly measuring that. And I think, and depending on larger companies are more sophisticated. I think council here has seen, mounds and mounds of paperwork to show all the procedures were taken from the company. But if it's a smaller company, if it's a non-union company, there's also consultants out there that they'll hire to bring in to do competency checks. So I think overall, again, not to go down into the weeds of the study or whether union or non-union is safer, I think we really need to focus on attraction. We really need to focus on the positives that construction brings to the table in terms of lifelong opportunities, in terms of the steps that contractors and the industry as a whole are making. The government has made significant investments right now in union training centers, in upgrading facilities for colleges that provide skilled trade for apprenticeships. On the non-union side, we've made millions of dollars of investment in training as well. Many of my members have invested. And so it's one thing is to say and talk safety, and to Amina's point, safety is not on the tools, on equipment. It's a culture of safety, making sure that when anybody walks onto a job site, if they're a foreign worker, that they have the proper supports there. There's language barriers, making sure that they're provided or given supports, and all contractors do it. I think it's important to take away that as an industry, we recognize that there's a shortage. We also recognize that we have to step up, and I think. Again, I've seen both sides of the story. I've represented both the union and the non, and contractors as a whole want to make sure that those people that they employ are trained, and there's an education piece we have to ensure that the public and that your viewers should know about, that we're committed to education on workplace harassment, on making sure that diversity and inclusion is part of the discussions. There's been so many hires and so many investments from companies hiring new managers that are diversity managers. And I've seen an increase of women coming into management positions. And I think it's incredible. And I think there's so many opportunities for people considering construction to come in. We talk about safety on the job site, but we also have to ensure that the system itself is supported. Estimators, accountants, project managers, they're in demand too. And all of that leads to, again, I go back to a culture of safety, because we want to ensure that we're inclusive and that we bring in the best and brightest anywhere.
Very good. Can we get Leila step in there as well?
I completely agree about having a safety culture and a safety-first attitude. The issue arises, though, when exceptions occur. So you had mentioned the 2009 incident that happened on Christmas Eve. That was a tragedy. 4 out of 6 workers were killed. And it is basically what happened is they were restoring balconies on some high-rise buildings. And it was Christmas Eve. There was a swing stage. 6 workers went onto the swing stage, and there were only 2 lifelines. The swing stage collapsed, and 4 workers died. One was very injured. One was able to climb back onto the balcony, but that was a tragedy. Some of those workers hadn't been in Canada for very long. Michael talked about having training in your own language. Well, as part of what happened there should have been some training in their language as to proper procedures to follow. There was also some marijuana found in the workers' systems after the fact. So that is one where, from a legal point of view, it's the first time that a person, and this was a foreman, was actually charged criminally and convicted to 3.5 years in prison. So there can be significant consequences. The company that was doing the work, they were fined under the OHSA. They were also charged criminally, and they paid a massive fine. But the families of those workers were the ones who really suffered at the end of the day. So while I agree that everybody thinks safety is important, when there are deviations, that's when we have this loss of life that nobody can make up for.
Shane, I'm going to come to you. Last month, construction workers in Quebec, we're looking out east, were protesting the new occupational health and safety provisions, which came into effect January 1st this year. Give us a little background on there. What's that about, and why should Ontarians be paying attention to what's happening there as well?
Well, what's interesting there is, again, we've got a dynamic here of, industry companies, business at odds with the union, with the unions there in Quebec, several different unions involved. And so what's going on is we have these new workplace health and safety provisions that are now essentially in effect there. But the employers, the groups of construction employers, the associations, they want it to be postponed. They want a delay because what they're arguing is that these new health and safety provisions, one of the things included in there is that there must be a union health and safety representative on each job site, depending on the size of the job. And what the employer associations are saying is that the law is unclear as to exactly what the qualifications would be for that health and safety representative appointed by the unions. And so, one, there's no pay structure involved. So how do we pay them? What qualifies them to be a health and safety representative? They say that kind of information is unclear. It's not made clear in the law, and they want it postponed. Additionally, they're worried about, well, who becomes in charge of safety on the site, right? Because already the construction companies, the employers, they need to have a health and safety professional on site already. Now you're going to have the unions appointing a health and safety representative who may or may not have health and safety qualifications, also in charge of health and safety on the site, sort of putting, it becomes an issue of, well, who's really in charge of health and safety on the site? And so that's why they're asking for a postponement. I'm not sure that they're going to get it, but again, it's that sort of friction between the employers and the unions.
We have about a minute left. Time goes by really quickly here. I'm going to come to you, Amina. Sort of a big question. Something that we've talked about a lot is on-site, a little bit of off-site. When we talk about things like opioid use with construction workers, mental health, big question here, but what do we need to create a safer, better future for construction workers in Ontario with that in mind?
Sure. So I think, again, making the point that health and safety is not just, it's all-encompassing now. You need buy-in, especially for these newer issues like diversity, equity, inclusion, and mental health. You need buy-in from top to bottom. But I think collaboration and communication is key, and early on. Not waiting for someone to come to you and be like, I'm struggling with my mental health or I'm struggling with an addiction. Not waiting for that to happen, so being a bit more proactive. Which is, I think, easier with issues like diversity, equity, inclusion, and mental health and addictions. It's the hazards are still there, but they're not as physical in front of you. So it requires you to be a bit more reactive. I think working with government the way we did with COVID, and giving it the same sort of urgency as COVID and some of these physical hazards that we're keeping in mind every day. And then the naloxone requirements, which are coming into effect as of June for certain employers and workplaces. I think that's great, but again, that is less about prevention. You're using a naloxone kit. That's like pretty much the last point. So a bit more prevention and removing the stigma within the culture of construction. It is male dominated. The macho culture still exists, and I think we need to be talking about that a lot more. Even though it's not always positive, I think we need to kind of come to terms with it. It is a very macho industry, and things aren't going to change as it relates to mental health if we don't kind of remove the stigma and get more women, really, and different people.
All right, we're going to unfortunately have to leave it there. Great stuff. Thank you so much, Amina, Michael, Shane, Leo. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
These are really desperate times for legacy media, newspapers, magazines, local TV newscasts, and so on. They are dealing with economic models that no longer work and audiences that mistrust them as never before. Jeffrey Dvorkin spent most of his life in journalism and academia, both in the U.S. and Canada, and has a book out on how to fix things. It's called Trusting the News in a Digital Age, Toward a New News Literacy. And it brings the former managing editor for CBC Radio, vice president of National Public Radio, and professor at 4 different journalism schools to our studio tonight. Great to see you here.
Nice to be with
I can't believe you've been in this game this long, and this is the first visit you've had to the studio.
Long overdue.
Shame on us. I agree. Okay, back to first principles here. When you and I learned how to do what we do, it was about the 5 W's, right? Who, what, when, where, why. And you think we need a how in there as well, so that everybody knows how what we're reporting is true. Why do we need a how as well?
I think my time at the U of T Scarborough, which was amazing, and the students were fantastic, and the students are overwhelmed. And if the students are overwhelmed, then presumably their parents are, and the rest of us are overwhelmed as well. And one of the first things I would ask them, these are first-year students, 18, 19 years old, very diverse as Scarborough is, a lot of international students, and they don't understand what is appropriate and what to believe and what to trust.
How do they not understand that?
Because they're swamped. It is a tsunami of stuff that they see on the monitors in the subway, that they, as soon as they turn on their smartphones and tap into their various media, they see a lot of stuff, and they have no idea, or very little idea at first, how to differentiate among the various flows of content that soaks them on a constant 24-hour basis.
But again, I'm going to go back at that. How do they not know the difference between the Globe and Mail and some piece of crap website that has no background or validity?
Because I think at the beginning of the process, they don't seem to differentiate among the various levels of journalistic value. So that, and especially they're very highly influenced, I think, by friends and family. And so when Uncle Fred says, oh, you have to see this, and it's terrific, and they look at it and they send it to another 20 people, but it may be, first of all, misinformation, which is, in my opinion, just sort of ideas that kind of are amusing and we all share it and ha ha ha. And disinformation, which is a deliberate lying to the public. And we saw this going back at least to the 2016 American election, where bloggers and hoaxers and criminal intent came from Russia and other places and basically tried to, not to tell people what's going on, but basically to plant doubts.
They took advantage of our media illiteracy.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, here's a quote from your book. Let me get this on the record here. Sheldon, you want to bring this graphic up? Journalism, writes Jeffrey Dvorkin, journalism is also being Uberized. There is less reliance on staff reporting and more reliance on content spread by freelancers and platforms such as Facebook and Twitter, resulting in less so-called enterprise reporting, where journalists are given the time and the resources to generate original journalism. I want to know what effect you think the Uberization of journalism has had on how much we trust what we read, see, and hear.
I think one of the problems has been that news organizations, and for my sins, I managed a couple of them, don't have the money or the resources, and they're being pressed to do more with less. That's the cliche, but it's a truth. And what's happened is that news organizations still have what they call a news hole to fill, an hour or 25 printed pages. They've got to fill it with something, and they don't have the resources that they once did. So if you're a young reporter in a newsroom and you go to your assignment editor and say, I've got a heck of a story, boss, and I need 10 days to get it together. And your boss is going to say, no way. I need you to fill the news hole today. Maybe I'll give you the day to do it, but that's about it.
We used to call it feeding the beast.
Feeding the beast, feeding the goat, exactly. Yeah. And the problem now is that news organizations are really strapped for money, and they're looking for ways in which they can generate audiences, generate eyeballs or ears. And one of the ways they're doing that is to, in my opinion, is to go after what's easier content to report, what I call the low-hanging fruit of local news. And that's often weather, traffic, and crime. Weather traffic and crime are all important if done properly, but an over-reliance on them is terrifying. And what it does is it makes the audience, the readership, the viewership frightened.
Well, I know you say in the book that, I mean, true or false, we love traffic, weather, and crime and a preponderance of it on our newscasts. And you say false, even though everybody's programming that in local news.
That's right, which is why I think there is a suspicion and a distrust of media, because it all seems to be the same, and it's all the same kind of moral panic that's being sowed by media organizations in order to capture that audience that has disappeared onto the internet.
Well, you ask a bunch of good questions in the book about how people can sort of know what to tune into, because you tell them you should find the good fit for you. And you ask the question, which news organization is most like you? And I want to ask you that question. As you consume news and current affairs, which organizations are most like you?
Well, first of all, without flattering you too much, I do watch you all the time. I listen to NPR. I read 3 print newspapers a day.
Which ones?
The Star, the Globe, and the New York Times.
Interesting. Not the National Post.
Occasionally the National Post.
Not the Sun.
Not the Sun.
How
the
come?
Sun, well, the Sun, as Michael Enright would say, is basically a news organization that has news content to separate the ads for fridges. And I think that that's still the case.
Those fridges pay for a lot of salaries.
Well,
it's okay.
That's true. However, I think what's happened is that in this digital environment that we find ourselves in, we are increasingly driven to sort of the lowest common denominator of gossip and celebrity news and weather, traffic, and crime, because it's easy to do. The irony is that weather, traffic, and crime all come from government sources. So the idea of independent news gathering is less prominent these days than ever before.
You ask another question. Which news organization do you distrust the most? So I'll ask you.
I distrust any news organization that doesn't identify itself. And when you go online, which we often do, it's important to go to the bottom of the homepage to see if there's an About Us place that you can click. If that doesn't exist, if there's nowhere on that website that you can contact that news organization and say, what the heck are you doing? I don't trust them. And we're seeing increasing amounts of media that is anonymous. But it's also very appealing in some ways because it's sort of gossipy. You recall, I'm sure, that it was Gawker Media in New York that broke the Rob Ford story.
Yep.
Because, in my opinion, Toronto media organizations were afraid to go after that story.
They had the story. They were afraid to publish it.
Exactly. Exactly.
All right. What can I just tell you? I find your answer interesting because, of course, naturally, you being a guy with a lot of history in public broadcasting and journalism schools, I asked you which news organization do you distrust the most, and I assumed you were going to say Fox, and you didn't say Fox News. How come?
Because I never watch it.
Oh, really?
I never.
Well, you should. It's hysterical.
I need to save my laughter for something a little more interesting.
Okay. Another question you ask: which medium do you go to when you wake up in the morning? How about you?
I look at my phone and see what has come in as urgent overnight, and that's from the Times, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, many other places. I think what we're finding now is that if I'm overwhelmed by this tsunami of information, a poor 18-year-old kid who's trying to grapple with all this is naturally very confused. And I remember I would ask my class at the beginning of each class, what have you seen in the media that you consume that you found interesting? Where did you find it, and why did you find it interesting? And this was, to me, this was the education that I wanted from teaching these students. And often they would say, well, I saw this on a website that I'd never heard of, or somebody a few years ago, one of my students said, well, there's TikTok. I don't know if you recall back in the olden days when an assignment editor said, Steve, I want you to do a TikTok on what happened today. And a TikTok in those days was to do a kind of an hour by hour, how the story evolved, and that was a TikTok. And so when the student said, well, we could do something on TikTok, I had no idea what he was talking about. And I realized at that point, it was time to try to look for something else.
Well, okay, that leads nicely to this next question, because back in our day, Woodward and Bernstein and their coverage of Watergate and their helping to, frankly, bring down an American president was so much of the inspiration that I think motivated us to either get into journalism or do better journalism or whatever. If you said Watergate, Woodward and Bernstein, Washington Post to your students today, would they know what any of that meant?
Not really. They would have to, first of all, I don't blame journalism education only, but we're seeing a lot of journalists, or a lot of students of journalism rather, coming into the business without a real appreciation or background to what has happened first in this city and secondly in this country. I would play a National Film Board of Canada documentary which came out right after the October crisis, a couple of years after the October crisis.
We should remind everybody, that's 1970, the FLQ, terrorism in Quebec.
Exactly, and the declaration of martial law by Pierre Trudeau.
Yes, War Measures Act.
None of them had ever heard of it. So I played this documentary for them and said, if you were a journalist in Montreal or in Toronto, under these circumstances, how would you report something that the government didn't want you to report? And they were astonished, and especially the international students. They said, I had no idea that that's what happened in quiet old Canada, that there was this turmoil. And I said, and the turmoil extended. There was something like 400 people that were arrested in Montreal without habeas corpus, many of them journalists. How would you report that? And what I wanted them to do was, there's no clear answer, obviously, but I wanted them to struggle with the idea that there is no clear answer. And to me, that's the essence of journalism. What the digital culture has done is that it has smoothed things out, it is simplified, it doesn't ask tough questions. And I think that, there's still some great journalism that's being done everywhere, including on Canadian television news and in the newspapers, but it's not the same as it once was. And I don't want to lament, saying, oh, I wish we were back in the good old days when I was young. Well, of course I do. But the issue now is that the digital culture has hollowed out journalism to an incredible extent. And we have to figure out ways in which we can, as citizens, demand more of our media.
Well, if it's not, okay, let's grant them this. Let's grant the younger people this. Watergate was 50 years ago. The War Measures Act was more than 50 years ago. What more recent event, if any, animates them or motivates them, inspires them to be better journalists? Is there anything?
A lot of them weren't born when 9/11 happened.
Yikes, that's right. That's more than 20 years ago now.
That's right. Yeah. And so when we talk about what are we going to believe and from which source, how do you verify the source of information? And this is one of the things that we talked about a lot, which is in the olden days, I'm much older than you, of course, but
not as much as you think.
We needed two sources in order to get a story right. That seems to have vanished. And the other thing is that there is a generation gap inside media organizations. I think journalism schools have done a pretty good job in getting people out there, and they're getting jobs. A lot of my students are ending up at the CBC and at the Globe and Mail. It's great, wonderful, and the Toronto Star. A lot of them come from very diverse backgrounds. Management is still, the older management cohort is still white, increasingly female, but of that idea that journalism is not a profession, it's a craft. And it's not like you come out of journalism school, like you come out of med school and say, okay, now I'm a doctor. You come out of journalism school and say, okay, let me get a job that can show what I can do for journalism. Now, to their credit, a lot of media organizations have hired these younger people from more diverse backgrounds, and they are less willing to take the time required to learn what the craft is. In fact, they want a seat at the table right away because they have been told that their ideas have value. There was an incident at the Toronto Star in the last federal election. Toronto Star, to its credit, does editorial boards on the record with all leaders of all the parties.
Who deign to show up.
And mostly for the Toronto Star, they will.
Okay.
They invited Maxime Bernier. And a lot of these younger journalists said, we're not coming to that editorial board because we don't like him. So one of the this became a bit of a crisis, a generation gap inside the newsroom. And the Toronto Star isn't the only one feeling this. The CBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post, there are these younger journalists who feel, for better or for worse, that they have something to offer, and they're not willing to work lousy shifts and do stories that they think are stupid, and then in 10 years, maybe they get a chance to talk at the morning editorial meeting.
Well, okay, you've got an excerpt in this book. Sheldon, let's go to page 4 here, board 2, because you've got an excerpt in the book that speaks to this. People go into journalism, you write, believing that they are performing a civic good. Many don't believe they enter the field to be advocates for specific values. In general, journalists believe that the power of information is ultimately liberating. The idealism of many journalists, combined with an innate sense of curiosity about the world, is what usually motivates people to become journalists. However, this also leaves them vulnerable to charges of bias. Of course, not all people who work in journalism are that high-minded. Some see journalism as a road to power, wealth, and influence. In some cases, this happens to be true. And I'd go on from that excerpt to say it feels like today, particularly what you've just described, that there are two kinds of journalists. There's the Sergeant Joe Friday journalist, just the facts, ma'am. And then there are those who, who are in it to and I understand this is a pejorative expression, but, they're social justice warriors. They have their view of how the world should be. And they intend to use journalism to affect that conclusion. They're picking a side. Do you have a problem with that?
Depends what the story is. Okay. I think that if I were a reporter at the CBC, which I was for a number of years, I would go out and I would try to do the story as fairly and as contextually as possible. That's because the news division at the CBC and in many other places felt that there was an obligation to report as close to the truth as possible. There was also a department called Current Affairs. And Current Affairs at the CBC allowed for if you like, a broader exposure to ideas and opinions and feelings and emotions. And that was entirely legitimate. The problem, in my opinion, is that everything is now information. And when it's all just information, it seems not to matter whether you're giving the audience the facts that allow them to make a decision or whether they are part of an emotional experience caused by events. So what we're seeing now is, and goodness knows that there are a lot of issues out there now that require and evoke an emotional response. We think of the issue around Indigenous lives in Canada, the war in Ukraine, COVID. It goes on. And it's very hard not to feel emotional about many of these issues. The question is, if you are in Ukraine doing a story on the latest bombing in Kyiv, it's very difficult to be dispassionate about that. And I think one of the things that we're seeing now is the need for a little more dispassion, or at least an appropriate expression of that passion in order to allow people to understand the story better. And I think one of the things that we're finding now in journalism is the limits of what I think is one of the limits of storytelling. Storytelling, and I'm complicit in this because back at the CBC, I talked about what is the focus of the story? And the focus statement for a story meant find an individual, describe what that person is going through, and talk about that person's emotional response, and that way we'll hook the audience to identify with the difficulties that this person is going through. And I think that at a time when context is lost and emotion has become heightened, because that appears to be a way in which news organizations can grab back that audience that's been dissipated onto the internet, I think that storytelling is kind of manipulative in some ways.
Well, okay, that speaks to the next issue I want to hit on with you, which is trust.
Yes.
We got a problem with trust right now. Sheldon, bottom page 3, Douglas Murray, New York Post columnist, clip from him from the Munk debate. This is a little over a month ago, arguing against trusting the mainstream media, even though he works for one. Let's go.
In this country, your media, your mainstream media, is funded by the government. A totally corrupted system. In 2018, election year, coincidence, the Canadian media is given $595 million over 5 years. In Canada, they can also tell the media what to do, and the media does the bidding of the Canadian government. That isn't a free society's media. I've seen unfree countries all my life. But this, in a developed liberal democracy like Canada, is a disgrace.
He's essentially calling the government's attempt to subsidize the legacy media because of their declining revenues to the tune of $600 million a disgrace. Do you agree?
I tend to agree. And part of it is that in my time in Washington, I guess I drank too much Potomac water. But I found that the idea of having a certain financial independence tends to make the journalism often better. Not always, but often better. And I think one of the things that we're finding now is that if the government gives money to media organizations without any conditions, in the same way that the provinces want the federal government to give money for healthcare
with no strings.
With no strings. Yeah. I think the problem is that if news organizations are given more money to do their job without changing the nature of the relationship between news organizations and citizens, then we're just rewarding mediocrity.
In which case, what do we do about, I mean, the newspapers say if we don't get those hundreds of millions of dollars, we're all going to die. And therefore, they've managed to convince the government that the government has an interest in a thriving democracy by keeping those newspapers alive. If you're concerned about what that relationship then becomes because of that subsidy, what do we do instead?
I have an idea.
Go.
I think we turn the media landscape on its head, and that we give more power to local sources of information. For example, in this group that I work with called Public Broadcasting in Canada for the 21st Century, we're proposing that the CBC basically reinvest in local news. Right now, there are news deserts in this country, especially out west, part of the Maritimes, where there's no coverage. And whatever coverage they can manage to cobble together is mostly weather, traffic, and crime. Okay, it snows in Alberta in the winter. That's not a headline.
This just in.
This just in, exactly. And I think that that's one of the ways that we could restore the value of journalism, which treats the audience as citizens first and consumers second.
That won't save newspapers.
It could save newspapers if the strings attached to this money would be to bolster their regional newsrooms and to allow for more investigative reporting. Local news and investigative reporting. It's the lifeblood of democracy in any country. And what we see here is, okay, we have some very good newsrooms in Montreal and Toronto, a couple other places perhaps, but not as much as this country deserves and requires.
Okay, I have another 40 questions I want to ask you, but I'm literally down to my last minute here, so I'm going to try this one. And I'm asking you this question because you've been, as we said in the intro, you've been teaching young people how to do this at 4 different journalism schools on both sides of the border. And my question is, do you think we're playing a cruel joke on these students by bringing them into journalism schools, educating them for a media landscape that frankly no longer exists. The jobs that they would hope to graduate into are disappearing.
I am more optimistic than that, I have to say. My students, many of whom stay in touch with me, thank goodness, are telling me they get jobs, various news organizations, which shall go nameless, and they're pushing. They said, well, why are we doing the story in this way? So one of my students, whose family comes from Uganda, he's a terrific kid, he's no kid anymore, he was told, he was working on the online site of this media organization. And his supervisor for his shift said, I want you to go on YouTube, find something vaguely Canadian, write some copy around it, and then it becomes our story. And my student said to him, well, why don't we do the story ourselves? And he said, we don't do that. We'd leave that to, and he named another news organization. And I think that the problem is that there's a lot of talent in newsrooms in this country, but they have been driven down by the relentless idea that it's ratings above all, and if we can't get the ratings, we're all in trouble. And instead of putting that on its head and saying, if we can't do journalism that serves the public contextually, that's what our goal should be. And if we can't do that, then we should be out of this business.
We've talked almost a half an hour and barely scratched the surface of your book, which was a terrific read, Trusting the News in a Digital Age Toward a New News Literacy, which, yes, we need. Jeffrey Dvorkin, thanks for coming into TVO tonight.
Thank you.
That is the agenda for Monday, January 9th, 2023. Tomorrow, we'll take a hard look at Canada's economic outlook in the wake of globalization and growing income inequality and ask, who is this economy working for? I'm Jane Jaganathan. Thanks for watching TVO and for joining us online at tvo.org. And Steve, we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.